On this episode of Hot Rod Hoarders, we run across the ultimate estate sale find. This is a quarter midget race car that was raced in the 1950s, and we're going to see if we can get this old school Bolens 2-cycle engine running again after it's been sitting for all these years. When my dad let me know that he had bought this toy, I start immediately trying to research what this thing could possibly be. As soon as I walked in the garage and saw it, I realized that what we're dealing with here is not just a little kid's toy. This is a pretty legitimate piece. I'm looking all around for tags or any kind of marking or identification or anything like that that can help us understand when this thing was built and who built it. So I looked this thing over pretty good, didn't find any kind of markings or identification, but this does have the letter B on that front grill guard, which I later found out that you could order these cars with a custom letter, like maybe the first letter of your first name or first letter of your last name. And in our case, our last name is Bird, so the letter B, I mean, it's absolutely perfect. This thing is going to be a piece that we hang on to forever. But of course, I still wanted to research and find some history on this thing so that I could tell you guys the story on it and figure out exactly where this thing might have come from. Because to be perfectly honest, Tennessee was not a place where quarter midget cars were raced. So the fact that this quarter midget car ended up in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but hopefully someday, somewhere down the road, I'll find that out and I'll be able to tell you more about it in a follow-up video. But for now, the idea is to go around this thing and start putting it back together so that we can really get a good idea of what parts might be missing, because we want to get this thing back to where we can run it and where one of my kids can get in there and drive it someday. And while I'm telling you the history on this car and what I've been able to find on it, you'll be able to watch me as I piece this thing back together, and be sure to stick around to the end when I attempt to fire this thing up for the first time in who knows how long. We initially started by looking through the parts box which came with this car. It had an engine in it, which is a great place to start, and it had some other parts and pieces and things that went along with the car. So that really helped us to know that we got more of a starting point, because these things, I had no clue where to even start as far as research, as far as what types of engines were common on quarter midget cars, and I learned a lot pretty quick after talking with some guys who were more familiar with these cars. The first two guys I wanted to contact to get information on this car was Joshua Shaw and Andy Root. Both of these guys know open wheel race cars. They've been around them for years. They've restored a bunch of cars. So I figured if anybody knew anything about one of these cars, these guys could point me in the right direction. So after those messages, I got a really good idea of where to start my research. And Andy actually gave me his opinion on what this car was, and he said it was an Offyette. Now again, I don't know anything about quarter midget race cars, and I've never heard of an Offyette. I had heard of an Offy, which is short for Offenhauser, and you know, those cars are pretty legendary open wheel cars, and this Offyette is sort of a smaller version of the Offy race cars. So, you know, the body design gives you that early sprint car look, maybe even early Indy car look. The stance, the body design, everything about this car is not like a goofy go-kart like what you see now, where it's got a big tall roll cage and just weird proportions. This car literally looks like a shrunken, legitimate race car. So then I start researching this Offyette quarter midget, and there's tons of information out there. There's tons of pictures, there's tons of good stuff that really helped me understand that this truly was an Offyette. But as I started to really dig into the details, I noticed some differences between the standard Offyette and this car that we bought. So, you know, it kind of got my wheels turning and got me to really obsessing over the details and over the research like I always do. And, you know, I got to a point where I just ran out of ideas. I ran out of things to research to try to find out why this car was different than the others that I'd seen. So during my research, I'd seen that a guy named Douglas Schiller had commented and been tagged in some Offyette content on Facebook. Well, what I found out was that he was directly connected with Offyette. In fact, his dad was the guy who created the Offyette. So it really gave me some hope that I was going to figure something out on the history of this car. So I reached out to him. He was very gracious and reached back out to me, gave me all sorts of great information, which I'm going to unpack in the best way that I can to be able to explain this car and explain just how rare it is. This is a car that may truly be one of a kind. Douglas was even nice enough to send me some original literature that his dad had kept for years. He had made some copies of it so that he could share this out and be able to help people understand and help people identify these cars. And he sent me reference pictures from a car that he had restored, and it really helped me to understand what parts were similar on this car and what parts were different. And that led to more conversations with Douglas and more information so that I could truly be able to document this car. Going way back to the beginning, a guy by the name of Carl Schiller put together a small race car for his son, Douglas. And this was back in like 1947 or 1948. By 1953, this miniature race car had been featured in a magazine called Speed Age. And this predates most all of the quarter midget race cars that gained popularity during the 1950s. But this was a special one-off car that really spawned an idea that evolved through the years. And by the time the article actually came out, the car had been retired and it had had several different renditions after that. So, you know, Carl was an engineer at heart. He was developing these cars and these prototypes, and he ended up starting a business named Schiller Engineering, and it was just run out of their attached garage at home, which is in Long Island, New York. And this idea just continued to blossom. And he ended up building the first few Offyette cars in 1955, which he called the Model 400E. Now these cars had some distinct differences from the later Offyettes, which got a little more popular. He sold a lot more of those later cars. So these early cars are much more rare. And based on information from Douglas Schiller, the X bracing in the floor of the body that we have is what signifies that it is a very early car. He says that only a dozen or so of these cars were built with the X floor bracing. Carl Schiller quickly outgrew the attached garage and ended up moving the operation to Garden City, New York, still operating under the Schiller Engineering name. Later he moved to Island Park, New York, and then eventually to Great Neck, New York, which is where the majority of the manufacturing happened from the late 50s all the way into the early 60s. According to Douglas, two major things happened when his father moved from the Garden City garage to the Island Park garage, the first of which was changing the name of the company. Instead of Schiller Engineering, it would now be known as the Lark Douglas Company Incorporated. An interesting tidbit about this name, Lark is actually Carl's name with the C and the L flipped, and then it's hyphenated, and Douglas is Carl's son, the guy I've been talking to. Douglas says that early on in Offyette manufacturing that his dad would sell these cars as complete turnkey cars, or he would sell them in pieces. So he would sell just the body or just the front suspension, and that appears to be what happened with this car that we bought. This appears to be a car that someone bought the body, the leaf spring front suspension, the rack and pinion steering, and possibly even the tires and wheels. The rest of the car is where it gets a little bit interesting, because all Offyettes have a monocoque body and frame design. This car, the one that we have our hands on, has an actual round tube frame that runs front to back. It ties in with the suspension, the steering, it ties in with everything on this car, and it also provides mounting points for the engine. Because originally the Offyette would have its own engine mounts, which were designed to accept a Continental 4-stroke engine. This was the standard engine for quarter midget racing. So when I realized they had a spec engine for this class, I realized that the Bolens engine that came with this car is not necessarily appropriate. But I also know that back in the 50s that two-cycle engines were used pretty commonly on lawnmowers. They were used on racing go-karts for other types of classes. So I knew that this was a period correct style engine, but it just didn't meet the quarter midget standards. So again, I'm off the trail again as far as research goes, and I'm trying to find information about this Bolens two-cycle engine. It's very small, very compact, and it does have a plate on it that allows me to see exactly the model number, everything about this thing. But unfortunately, there's not a tremendous amount of information about these engines on the internet, at least. So I'm still digging around for information to figure out where this engine might have come from. But based on the model number, I found that it was available in 1952 and 1953. That sort of aligns with the early construction of this body. And the engine itself, I'm really impressed with the engineering on it. This thing's got a custom racing carburetor. It's got a custom wet clutch system, which doesn't appear to be standard for anything. So, I don't know exactly how this thing came about, but it's got some really, really cool pieces on it. But what I keep going back to is the fact that there are chrome-plated pieces on this car. And if you were just building this thing in your backyard for your little boy to race, I don't think that you would send off the rear suspension pieces and the rear push bar and all those pieces. I don't think you would send that off and have it chrome plated. And there wasn't like a chrome shop in every little town. And another couple of additions that look a little bit outside of the realm of just some dude in his garage was this clutch lever. It operates a lever that's on the engine case. This is not your standard piece. This is chrome plated. It's mounted with a really nicely built bracket. It's got some really nice linkage. This isn't something that somebody just pieced together in their backyard. Other cool additions on this car are the two pull cables that are underneath the seat. So the driver would be able to pull one of those cables and he or she could prime the carburetor by pulling on that cable. It would pull a small lever down and push the plunger on the carburetor to prime it. The other cable looks like it operated the spark advance lever, which is on the engine and also served as a kill switch. So after I stuck together all the parts we had available to us, I was able to see that the engine was still free. I didn't see anything visibly wrong with it. It just wasn't in the car. So, after I bolted it in and got a better idea of what all these levers and pulleys and all these different things do on this car, I started trying to figure out what it was going to take to actually make it run again. Now, most people would say that you'd need to completely tear this thing down and completely go back through it 100%, with new parts and new everything just to be on the safe side. Well, I didn't really want to be on the safe side. I wanted to see if this thing was going to fire. So my first step was to kick it over a couple of times, and you'll notice that it has this really cool little kickstart. It's a 1/2-inch drive, like a square socket that fits into a hole, and you just kick it over. And of course I moved it over with my hand several times just to kind of get things moving, make sure there was nothing out of the ordinary. And then we started checking to see if the ignition was working, if we were going to get a spark. And eventually, after wiggling that spark plug around and getting that terminal tightened up a little bit on the spark plug, it did start sparking. And that was all that I needed to know, because I knew then that I could pour a little bit of gas in this thing and we might hear a little bit of noise. It's got a pretty good sized fuel bowl, so I pushed down on the little plunger, and it's sort of like early British motorcycles that have a primer like this, where you basically push down on the button until gas starts running out of it. Well, I did that, and I pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, and finally we got the fuel bowl filled up and gas started running out of it. And we knew at that point that we had enough fuel to see if this thing was going to actually fire and try to run. So by hand, I'm just kind of pushing it around, I'm turning it over, trying to make sure that we're feeling some compression, that we're not feeling anything out of the ordinary. Well, I finally got enough nerve to, instead of using my hand, to stand up and use my foot to give it a real good kick. And all of a sudden this thing just came alive. Now, it didn't run for very long because we didn't have very much fuel up to it, and we didn't know much about the timing or anything like that. But this thing made noise, and my dad just got the biggest kick out of it. And we knew then that we could piddle with this thing just for a little while, and we could actually make it to where it'll crank up and run. What I found is there is a spark advance lever on the bottom of this engine, and that's what really got this thing to where it will sit there and run. And of course it smokes because it's a 2-cycle, and there's some more things we got to do, but I was just thrilled to death to be able to fire this thing up and run it and hear this thing. I mean, it's a rowdy little 2-cycle engine. It's tiny, but you know, these things make pretty good power. So I was just blown away when we were able to fire this thing up with no real drama. I mean, we just basically stuck it back together using the parts that were available, and we made this thing run again. So I hope you enjoyed following along with the research aspect of this thing and the little bit of piddling we did to get it running again. Now we just need to figure out some brakes and maybe some tires, maybe a few more little odds and ends to make this thing a little more functional. And maybe one of these days we'll do a follow-up video if I can track down more information about where this thing may have come from, and hopefully a follow-up of possibly one of our kids driving it. So this is just a really cool project. This is definitely a keeper. This is something we're going to hang on to for lots of years. So tune in again next week for another new video. Thank you for watching.